So that's enough of me talking about all the things the Harris Center is doing. Tonight we have the incredible Phil Brown, a wonderful naturalist, an amazing bird watcher, and the person who organizes the Raptor Watch up on Pack. We're so lucky to have Phil involved with the Harris Center. If you ever get a chance to go birding with Phil, he's probably one of my favorite people to go birding with. I'm not a birder. He never makes me feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And tonight he's going to get us all up on what's happening, what the numbers tell us from our Raptor Watch. So Phil, thank you for doing this. I give you an applause. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Susie. That's such a warm welcome, and thank you everybody for tuning in tonight to learn a little bit more about raptors. So I'm going to get right into the program since there's a lot to cover, but I want to give everybody a chance to chime in with questions and leave a little bit of time at the end so I can attempt to answer some of your raptor questions. So Miles will be handling that. So please do ask away and we'll try to get to those things. In the meantime, though, I'm going to talk about raptor populations and what we've learned from watching hawks at Pack Monadnock Raptor Observatory in Peterborough, the Harris Center and New Hampshire Audubon's own Hawkwatch over the last 15 years. So we have some new numbers that are hot off the press here to share. So, all right, so welcome to the program. I'm going to be talking about what the numbers tell us, what we've learned from the Hawkwatch and how this compares with some of the other trends that are happening in the Northeast. So first, I'll again introduce myself as the Hawkwatch coordinator at the Harris Center, and I'm here representing this long-term raptor migration research project that we have at Pack Monadnock. It's one of it's the longest current running Hawkwatch in New Hampshire, and it's one of very few in northern New England. So it serves a really vital role in filling in some gaps in the data. So I'll tell you all about that. So I'll start by talking about a recent study that showed that globally 18% of raptors are threatened with extinction and that 52% have declining populations. So those are pretty alarming numbers. These are high proportions of those species, higher than birds in general in many cases. The forest-dwelling migratory species seem to be hit the hardest, faring the poorest overall. So these are pretty alarming trends. We've all read some alarming things of late in the last couple of years. Different studies have come out and have shown us how many birds are declining. The 3 billion bird study from last year was a really alarming one, showing us that many of our migratory birds are threatened for various reasons. They could be things like power line collisions, towers, windows, cats, but raptors, specifically raptors, even though they've recovered really well since the ban of DDT in the early 1970s, and from the cessation of shooting raptors in the mid 20th century, they're still suffering here at home in North America too. Native habitat loss is probably the leading cause of decline. There are many different threats, including loss of native habitat, power line collisions, inadvertent poisoning, development of energy, unsustainable forestry or agriculture, and what we're finding, climate change as well. Although the research there still needs a lot of work, as it does in a lot of these areas. So, in recent years, even though raptors are technically protected, raptors and birds are still being threatened by efforts to weaken the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which we've been hearing a lot about in the past year. This act has protected birds for the last 100 years, so still something to be vigilant about. And to quote the protector of Hawk Mountain, Rosalie Edge, to borrow from Lori's presentation last week, if any of you were on that, this is a great quote, and it spoke to me last week, and still, means a lot now. The time to protect a species is while it is still common. So we have to remember that we shouldn't let it get this bad. The efforts to protect species in a reactive way when they're already threatened or endangered is far more costly, far more difficult, far more unsuccessful in many ways. So this is where Hawkwatchers come in. Hawkwatchers have made the most significant contribution to our knowledge of raptor migration across the continents and in New Hampshire. Accurate knowledge of the population status and change is really important for bird conservation in general. So having a baseline is critical, and then being able to follow up with a long-term study is essential in following up. Lack of reliable information on the populations of raptors forms a really conspicuous gap in North American bird monitoring. But now we have a new tool, going back a decade or more actually. The Raptor Population Index was founded by a collaboration of research organizations, Bird Studies Canada, Hawkwatch International, Hawk Mountain, and the Hawk Migration Association of North America. And periodically, this tool, which is refined to help determine raptor populations, periodically comes out with a new release. So right now we just have a little bit of a sneak preview here tonight. So I do have some new trends from Pack Monadnock, which is one of the 60 sites in the Western Hemisphere, which is included in this most recent data analysis. The last analysis was done in 2016. So everything you might have seen me talk about before relates to numbers through 2015. Now, though, we have a chance to see how our own data have been analyzed right through last fall's hawk count. So the website here, rpiproject.org, has a lot of that information, and there's more to come. More will be released shortly. So generally, though, here's a little map of where the RPI sites, the count sites that have met certain criteria, are around the country and around the northern, the Western Hemisphere. Most are in North America, most are in the Northeast. So that's no coincidence. Hawkwatching got its start in Pennsylvania. You can see a big cluster of red dots in the Northeast, right in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and then a lot around the Great Lakes as well. So, you know, hawkwatching has a real stronghold in this part of the world. And there are some really great places to watch hawks because of the ways they funnel down ridge lines and along shorelines of the coast, along shorelines of the Great Lakes. And then to some extent, there are other points around the country that have those same features that really funnel the hawks through. So mostly coastlines and mountains, but also river valleys are good places to watch. So a little bit more, though, about the Raptor Population Index itself and how it chooses its Hawkwatch sites for putting together this great tool that analyzes the data. Sites need to be active for 10 years or more. They have to count hourly data, so they have to have hourly observations of all raptors seen, along with data such as weather and wind. Excuse me. So Pack is only one of 2 sites in northern New England that actually meets this criteria. So, so we're definitely, you know, in the top tier as far as our methodology and our standardization. And see, so we've learned a lot over the past 10 years about some of these trends. So looking at just a selection of these hawkwatches in the eastern US, we can see considerable declines for many of the regularly occurring hawks. So you can see this list here of decreasing is just about the same length species-wise of anything that's, you know, kind of a stable population or birds that have increasing populations. And I do have a few disclaimers to talk about here because it's not a perfect science. And, you know, you might be a little alarmed to see certain species on the list of decreasing, such as Osprey and Cooper's hawk, red-tailed hawk, that you might think are doing quite well. So what we're talking about here is declining populations in certain flyways along different flyways. So this is purely for the eastern flyway and migration in general. It doesn't speak to, is the species truly declining as a whole. So just a few disclaimers that I'll talk you through here is that hawk watching isn't a perfect science. There can be year-to-year variations having to do with winds and weather and other variables. Standalone data from one Hawkwatch location has really limited value. So just looking at our one site without looking at what's going on around us in the region, we'd certainly be missing things. Sometimes the birds miss the ridge lines where we're counting, and they will generally fly past a different ridge to the east or west. So, you know, year-to-year changes are pretty standard. The time frame, which is usually a 10-year data set, for this period of time is going to be looking at 2006 through 2019 data for Pack Monadnock. And from 2006 through 2011, we only had very limited November data because our Hawkwatch season was a little bit shorter back then. In 2012, we made the decision to lengthen it to try to fully include the period of migration. So we've counted through November 15th or 20th, depending on the year, ever since then, collecting regularly hourly data. And that certainly does affect some of the species totals and some of the analysis as well, because we have more days in the season. So this tool the math will change a little bit depending on the length of the season. And I'll get into that a little bit as we go on. The trends that I'll be talking about reflect the migratory status of the raptors, as I said. And we only have data for about 13 of the 15 species right now, because the other two are later season migrants and we don't have a large population flying through. And then lastly, the statistics of this analysis is definitely not my area of expertise, so I'm mostly trying to interpret the trends here. But Pack Monadnock itself, the observatory, if you haven't been there, in Peterborough, New Hampshire, is at the top of Pack Monadnock Mountain, Miller State Park. It's 2,290 feet in elevation. It's a spruce-covered summit. We have this little platform where you can see the lead counter Levi up above the trees and above the fog down below in the valleys. That's our usual setup, lots of infrastructure. This year we have these little wooden boxes to keep us COVID safe, keep us apart a little bit. We have signage that interprets what's been seen every day, historical trends, snazzy photographs of raptors up there. It's a beautiful spot to observe birds. It's a nice view to the north. You can see all the way out to Mount Washington on a clear day, which will be shortly snow covered if it's not already. We watch other little birds too. All birds matter up here. The red-breasted nuthatch here, which we've been seeing a lot of, is just one of several dozen species of birds and other taxa as well that we study. We watch and count monarch butterflies. We track those each year. We try to do some attempt of counting dragonflies when we can. It's not the easiest thing. And there's a usual picture of the setup with a few of our dedicated volunteer observers who are really important in helping us maintain this site year after year. It's proven to be an excellent site for seeing raptors. We average over 11,000 migrant raptors per season, making it one of the most productive sites in northern New England. In fact, the 11,000th bird was just tallied yesterday. So we're right on track this year for at least an average and probably slightly above average year. So that's good news. We have lots of hawks to look at. The Harris Center on Audubon co-sponsor the education monitoring efforts now. The daily coverage, as I mentioned, goes through November 20th. I should mention that it started September 1st, as it does each year. So getting into the numbers a little bit here, you'll notice something fairly striking. One species makes up more than 3/4 of our annual count, and that is the broad-winged hawk, of course, one of the most common raptors in New England in summer and certainly in migration. So broad-winged hawks migrate through mostly in September during a really short window of about 2 weeks when 95% or more of them will pass through. So it's a real fantastic spectacle. It's really what a lot of people get excited about in terms of hawk watching, which is, you know, it's an activity that goes on all fall, but September is really the time when the masses come out to see the spectacle of broadwing hawks, which can show up by the dozens or hundreds or sometimes even thousands in a day. So it's truly spectacular. But the other species, 14 of which we regularly observe here, make up that remaining 23% or so. Sharp-shinned hawk is the next most common, coming in at around 10%, usually over 1,000 birds in a season. And the other 13 species, much less common, make up the 13%. So just a quick look at some numbers here. Looking at average counts, this is the list of regularly occurring species. And comparing the mean count, the average count, to last year's numbers, 2019. Just highlighting a few of these. And it's always fun to analyze the differences and see how things have changed year to year. And there's always variability, not just, you know, as a whole, but within the species, you know, depending on the weather, the timing of the cold fronts, if the cold fronts even hit us at the right time. So, you know, weather is really critical in figuring out, in determining what we're going to be seeing. So just a few things I'll call out is that last year we had a pretty good year for turkey vultures, bald eagles, red-shouldered hawk, and peregrine falcon. Those were notable highs in blue. We had a couple of really low tallies as well, Northern Goshawk and red-tailed hawk in red. And the rest were probably somewhere in the fairly average range. So if you like numbers, I'll encourage you later to check out the hawkcount.org website, and you could really analyze some of these numbers. But now I'm going to dive right into the numbers and the species in general. Oops. Second. Sorry. Okay, you still have my screen there?
Looking good.
Okay, thanks. So let's start with the Buteos. We're going to go species by species here, and I've prepared graphs on top showing that 14-year trend, and then we have the new RPI graphs, official RPI graphs, on the bottom left of each of these pages, which shows the trends themselves. Really, the number to pay attention to here is the first one that appears after the bird's name on the bottom left, the negative 7.41 in this case for the red-tailed hawk, and that's the per year decline, the percentage decline for this species. So we'll jump right into it here. Red-tailed hawks. The ubiquitous red-tailed hawk is actually a declining species, as far as we can tell during Hawkwatch season. It's usually an October migrant overall. October and November are the best months to see migrating red-tailed hawks. We can see up to about 70 on a season, in fact. So that's a pretty nice tally. I'm sorry, 70 in a day. You can see 70 red-tailed hawks in a day, slowly making their way to the south, kind of kiting along the way, hunting. They can present a real challenge in figuring out if they're really migrating. So spending time up there later in the season, you'll get a sense of how the red-tailed hawks are moving. It seems like they're just inching their way south, and they're almost never going to make it to where they're going. And that seems to be what's going on with red-tails in general. These are shorter distance migrants, and they're really not going that far. In fact, they might be stopping short of migration some years. There's a term called short stopping, which conservation biologists are noting is one feature that red-tailed hawks are consistently showing in many of the eastern and central hawk migration locations. The data too is showing that there are more wintering red-tailed hawks in the northern parts of their range. So we're getting some contrasting, conflicting messages here. Are they increasing or decreasing? What's going on here? If they're showing up in the winter more in the north, and they're becoming less common in migration, how do we reconcile these trends? So they may just be getting less migratory overall and taking advantage of food sources that are more abundant in the north, or maybe later falls, more generous falls. That seems to be what's going on with them. So you can see an RPI map from the RPI website on the bottom left. And those arrows and dots, red being declining trends at Hawkwatches, blue being stable, fairly stable, or not significant changes, are showing how many of these locations are noticing fewer red-tailed hawks migrating each year. So we're right in that category. You can see the big red dot here for Pack Monadnock, the big red downward arrow. So we have a pretty consistent trend with other Hawkwatch sites in the Northeast in seeing red-tailed hawks short stopping. So a little bit about climate change and raptors. Since it's come up here, that short stopping may be a direct result of climate change. Human activity is certainly causing our climate to change. And as temperatures rise and climate patterns are altered, we can expect to see more of an acceleration of changes to these landscapes and to the species that depend on them. And for raptors, this might manifest in shifts of their ranges, changes in migration timing, maybe changes to the prey base, what's going on with the smaller rodents. Red-tailed hawks seem to be tied into red-backed vole populations. If the voles have a particularly good year, we might see many younger red-tailed hawks fledge to survival, and the population be higher that following year, and then slowly dropping again, and sometimes crashing, depending on the crash of the prey items. So lots of potential changes going on with climate change that we don't fully understand. We need more research. So this is a significant part of how we're going to find out, is maintaining the Hawkwatch. So jumping into the cousin of the red-tailed hawk, the red-shouldered hawk. This is a species that mainly passes the Hawkwatch in October. We've seen several already coming through. It's a less common species in northern New England. They typically inhabit the deciduous forests and swamps. So, our habitat isn't quite as suitable now, but it certainly could be in the future. And we are seeing an increase, 4.6% per year, in fact, over the last 14 years. So perhaps some encouraging news for red-shouldered hawks, which other studies have shown do not do very well with development. And suburban red-shouldered hawks are, I think, a little bit less likely to raise successful broods. So, New Hampshire has that going for it, being a large rural area, and perhaps a more favorable climate for red-shouldered hawks coming up. Let's see. And in the East Coast, we're seeing pretty stable numbers of red-shouldered hawks overall. Now, let's get into Broadway hawks. They're an interesting case study. So they're seen in huge numbers at all locations along the Appalachians, and they represent 77% of our migrants each fall, passing within a really short window in mid to late September. So you see the graph, and there's some pretty high variability in the numbers. We've had as few as about 4,000 in 2009, and over 16,000 in 2015. That was truly a remarkable year to see, several days of many thousands of Broadway hawks passing through. So there is such high variability in numbers. And really a lot of it probably has to do with being at the right place at the right time. This would be the weather conditions and wind speed and direction, are probably more favorable in those years that we have the spikes of over 10,000 birds. We get cold fronts at the right time during mid to late September. We get good visibility too. That can be a major factor. We've had days where Pack Monadnock is just about 200 feet too high and we're stuck in the clouds, and we find out that Putney Mountain, the Hawkwatch out in Vermont along the Connecticut River, will have 1,000 or 2,000 birds more than we do some days. So, it seems like, just being in the clouds makes a big difference. We certainly miss birds passing through. So detectability is a challenge, but all the more importance of having many Hawkwatch sites and this real network to show what the real trends are. So I mentioned that that Hawkwatch data are not perfect, and even though we strive for consistency, there's no doubt that more eyes that we have up there produces more broad-winged hawks too. Sometimes the kettles, which are these large formations of broad-winged hawks using thermals of warm air, these kettles can just appear when you have 10 people watching instead of 1 or 2. So the effort has changed over the years a little bit. We used to have just a few regular counters in the early days. Now we've become a very popular place where lots of hawk watchers are helping us find lots of hawks. So it's kind of hard to account for that effort, but we do our best to try to follow the same protocols anyway. So not a perfect science. And so despite the big numbers and the fluctuation, we've found that by looking at one particular Hawkwatch site, here's a plug for Veracruz, Mexico. By looking at that one site, they see 95% of the entire population of this species passing through. 95% of broad-winged hawks pass through Veracruz, Mexico, which is this big star at the bottom in central eastern Mexico. Birds from all over the eastern flyway, the Great Lakes, the few birds that are coming from the central part of Canada. This is really an eastern species, but they're all being funneled along the Gulf Coast. And these birds, they don't fly over large mountains, such as the spine of the Rockies, which goes through Mexico. And they don't like to fly across large bodies of water, like the Gulf of Mexico. So all the broad-winged hawks from the continental US pass through this narrow strip here where the mountains almost meet the sea and give us the Veracruz effect, which we'll hear more about next week. I really encourage you, as somebody who's been there a couple of times, to see that remarkable migration. Just coming out next week and listening to Kashmir's talk about that. But so Veracruz will count 95% of these each year, and they've shown a really remarkably steady line here, showing the trend on the upper right compared to the Pack Monadnock trend through 2016, which showed quite a bit of an increase, in fact, 6.8%. Broad-winged hawks at Veracruz, though, fairly steady to maybe a little bit negative. So, so sometimes just looking at one site is all you need when you have a place like Veracruz. Sharp-shinned hawk, the number 2 raptor in most abundance at Pack, shows a pretty remarkably consistent trend year to year, especially considering their large number, about 1,000 to 1,400 per year. There are always some strange anomalies, like this 2018 year when the count was far lower than it had ever been by several hundred birds. But we are seeing slight declines at many Hawkwatch sites in the east and at our site as well. So sharp-shinn's declining at about -2% per year in this most recent analysis. And East Coast sites are showing that at least half of the Hawkwatches in the East Coast that were chosen for the analysis are showing declines as well. So Cooper's hawk, maybe a little more familiar to some of you as a backyard bird, and chicken hawk, another favorite name for them. They're actually a lot less common at the Hawkwatch, but maybe perhaps a more common backyard bird since they do so well with human habitation. They've done very well in the northern parts of their range in recent winters. Christmas bird count data is showing strong increases for the species in many eastern sites. So they too, like the red-tailed hawk and probably like the sharp-shinned hawk, are doing a little bit less migrating because conditions might become a little more favorable for them. They frequent farms and cities. They pick off pigeons just as well as peregrine falcons do, probably. So these guys make their living around people. This year there might be a lot of blue jays for them to eat. Lots of blue jays migrating through. But they've shown about a 3.5% decline per year at Pack. So again, probably has to do with them just not migrating as much. So the species perhaps is doing just fine, but more data is needed for sure. And now the largest of the accipiter family hawks, the Northern Goshawk. This bird is built like a red-tailed hawk, but it has the long tail that's distinctive of the accipiter family. And they're a little bit more of a mystery in our region and a lot less common than the previous two. Even though this species breeds and winters in our area, their presence is fairly undetected overall throughout the year. Many of you would be lucky to see a goshawk at any one time. If you have chickens, though, in your backyard, you might see goshawks more frequently. I know that's how we see them here. They come in and try to get our chickens. They're also dictated by a cyclical pattern based on snowshoe hare abundance in the northern US and Canada. And hare seem to be on about a 4-year population peak. And you could kind of see there have been some 4-year or more or less gaps here, or some spikes in the neighborhood of 4 years. Some of the sites in the Midwest that see a lot more goshawks than us show that spike trend a lot more than we do. But according to all sites, or almost all sites in the Northeast, these guys are truly declining. 3/4 of the Hawkwatch sites, 16 of them in the East Coast, have shown declining trends, and the other 4, I guess, have shown maybe some stability, but we've seen 10% per year decline. The days of 60 to 70 goshawks seems to be behind us right now. I'd be surprised if we get back to that number in the next few years. So we need a big rabbit year, perhaps. They also will feed on ruffed grouse in this area, and medium-sized songbirds and other mammals. But always a treat if you see goshawks around. Sometimes they are a little bit of a danger to people too, so you have to keep some distance from a goshawk if it's nesting in your backyard, as several people locally have found out recently. So a species that's like the goshawk in many ways, maybe in size and somewhat in shape, is the Peregrine Falcon, but very opposite trends. Peregrine Falcons have been increasing. This bird was basically nearly extinct. It had to be brought back with a lot of human intervention, and has now expanded its breeding range to include city towers and bridges, in addition to the cliffs that it is had historically always nested on, from the high Arctic now down into the southern US. So this species, though, as a migrant, certainly on the increase. They will stick around for the winter in some areas and cities as well. So there's some thought that maybe peregrine falcons could also become a little bit less migratory. We have a famous local peregrine falcon. Maybe some of you have followed the peregrine falcon cam from Manchester every spring. And that pair comes back to a large building in Manchester, Brady Sullivan Tower, I think, and raises several chicks. One year, I think there were 5 peregrine chicks that came out of that box that was installed at the edge of an office window. And it's so there's a webcam where you can see the day-to-day comings and goings of the parents and feeding the chicks. So it's really spectacular to see them do what they do. But yeah, peregrines have been on the rise. We've had 2 years of 64 peregrines now, 2 of the last 3 years. However, this year looks like we're falling way behind the trend. it was alarming to see how few we had by the end of September this year. I think only 6 compared to the average of well over 20 at that point. So they've bounced back a little bit in the last couple of weeks at Pack. So maybe we're not going to see a record low year, but still something to keep an eye on. Sometimes, though, we could see about 10 on a single day, and they're always a thrill to see, even if you just see one. Fastest bird on Earth, they always put on a show. And speaking of another bird that puts on a show, the merlin, which is the smaller cousin of the peregrine, is more common at Pack than many places. They, in addition to getting the migrants there, we seem to get a few locals that like to come around and harass the blue jays and the local songbirds. They dive at the fake owl, the fake plastic owl that we have on a pole. It's always a great show when a merlin comes by. And merlins have become more common over the last decade and a half. We're seeing a slow increase with a few big spike years, which has appeared to have leveled off in the more recent years. Getting back to some of those numbers from the early years. So merlins, hopefully a good sign. Their breeding range has expanded from Canada and now all the way down into lower New York State. So this is a species that's moving the opposite direction of what you might think, where climate change is the only force in action. Some species are actually expanding their range to the south. So here, this map from Rpi showing a real mix of trends throughout the country. A lot of blue dots meaning stability, but some increases, some decreases. So they could be responding to some local threats or challenges, or maybe just some local factors that dictate migration trends. Okay, the American Kestrel, one of my favorites, a really colorful raptor, a very small raptor, is one that we've been pretty concerned about for a long time now. In recent decades, they've been declining in many places all around the country. Here, we're showing some stability at Pack. There's been a rebound of kestrels in the past 4 years. And in fact, really good news from last week was that we just broke the all-time kestrel record at Pack. So we actually posted the highest number in our last 15 years, just this in 2020. So there's some reason for hope that we might be seeing a little bit of a bounce in kestrel populations, or at least local populations, due to efforts of people putting up nest boxes and organizations trying to study kestrels a little bit more and manage for them. This is a species that will respond well to a well-placed nest box in the right habitat with the right management too. You need to keep the starlings at bay. That's one of the big threats to kestrels, because they're not very aggressive, and starlings are. They'll sometimes be kicked out. So, so good news for kestrels. Hopefully we get to see that trend continuing. But as you can see in the east, at least according to the last RPI analysis, which is the map on the bottom right, still showing a lot of big downward red arrows. However, it seems like 3/4 of the sites in this most recent analysis, which just came out this year, are showing some stabilization of kestrels in the east. Let's move on to Osprey, another species which we're actually starting to get concerned about now. There's been a decline in migratory numbers across the Northeast, especially in inland areas, over the last couple of decades. And this has followed the strong recovery of the species post-DDT. Ospreys were one of the poster birds for DDT and its challenges. Bald eagles and peregrine falcons were the others. But ospreys were suffering from thinned eggshells and just not rearing young because of those eggshells breaking under them. But now the newest threat to osprey is likely the expansion of bald eagles, ironically. So here we are recovering one species, and there are some ripple effects and having some negative impacts on another native species. So unintended consequences for doing good conservation work. But hopefully there's more to it. Hopefully ospreys can bounce back. At some point, ospreys and eagles, worked out a balance well before we came into the picture, becoming a problem for either of them. So hopefully they'll find a way to stabilize. It looks like what's going on with ospreys locally is that their nesting population is being pushed away from the choice nesting areas on lake shores and rivers. Now eagles are taking off and taking over those choice sites, pushing the ospreys into beaver swamps where they might use an old great blue heron nest, or even power line corridors. And if they're in power line corridors, they have more chance for electrocution. So that's not a good place to nest a lot of the time. So we can see their decline at 3.34% per year. And, showing some, population gains have leveled off a little bit, but many sites are showing decreases. So coastal ospreys still seem to be posting some good numbers. Northern harrier, state endangered breeding species, their populations are showing long-term declines in the east and around the country. At Pack, it's about 2.5% per year, declining in the east as well. And it demonstrates a need for a broader front of migration monitoring and conservation efforts. They could be using different corridors. That could be part of it, but we know their breeding population has not been doing well. They've been suffering from native habitat loss and habitat conversion. New Hampshire Audubon has recently launched a harrier conservation project focused on northern New Hampshire where they breed. And this summer, some of our biologists, who are also our Hawkwatch biologists, have counted 5 or 6 pairs of ospreys, of northern harrier in that part of the state. Just a quick check on time here. Am I doing okay, Miles?
Yeah, we've got about 12 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to whiz through the last couple here. Bald eagle, showing strong increases at Pack and in the east. We've seen about 11% per year increase. It's a steady growth all the way. We're seeing record numbers year after year after year, and it looks like we're probably on pace for another one this year. I would venture a guess. The same trends are playing out in many other sites in the east. Very similar lines, exponential growth in a way. Only in the west do we see a few red arrows pointed downward in recent years. So, eagles are still suffering in some parts of the country due to specific threats. So golden eagles, I posted this graph here just showing their numbers over the years. Their populations aren't big enough to be part of this analysis. So we don't really know how our Pack Monadnock goldens are doing, but we know in the East Coast, the population seems to be stable. This is one of those kind of surprising statistics to many people, is that we do have a pretty decent East Coast population passing through from Eastern Canada, Northern Central Canada, passing to the east of the Great Lakes, flying down ridge lines and wintering in the mid-Atlantic states, mostly in western parts of the Appalachians. So, but we see about 8 to 10 golden eagles per year on average. 2 years ago, we had 22, which was our record high, along with 6 in a day. So you can see golden eagles in the east. Always a rare treat, but October and November are the times to see them. So get out to Pack and bundle up. All right, I think we're on to the last species here that I'll talk about, and that's the turkey vulture. Technically not really a raptor, but it's a carrion eater. But we count them anyway since they behave like raptors and they migrate along with raptors. They are increasing at about 8% per year. We've seen really big numbers the last few years, with one exception. And this species has been doing well ever since it was discovered as a breeding bird in New Hampshire 4 decades ago. right around Willard Pond, I believe. So yeah, this species has expanded its range far north from that point. So you can be part of the solution here to keep the data coming in. Learn more about the observatory. Visit the observatory. There's a link there on top showing you how to make a reservation to Miller State Park, and contribute to the research efforts that the Harris Center and Audubon are making happen every year. And then lastly, learn more about some of the network of raptor monitoring sites. I'll leave that on for a minute here before I post the last one, but maybe we can get right into questions with that. I want to save about 10 minutes.
Sure, Phil. Actually, here's a great question about vultures. Kathleen's wondering if there are other vultures in New England, and I know that sometimes black vultures can be seen. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so yeah, black vulture is the other vulture species in our part of the world. They too, like turkey vultures, have been expanding their range, and in recent decades, they've started showing up with greater frequency in New Hampshire and in northern New England. They seem to be nesting as far north as western Massachusetts now, but we haven't had a documented nesting bird in New Hampshire, as far as I know. However, every summer they're showing up. We have yet to see one at the Hawkwatch in the last 15 years. I think one was seen during a pilot season 16 years ago.
Wow, interesting.
So we've been waiting every year.
And so, and you mentioned before that turkey vultures weren't a nesting bird. They were first sighted 4 decades ago. So I'm just
a nesting bird. Yeah,
a nesting bird. Mm-hmm. So prior to that, like with the historical record, they weren't found in New Hampshire.
I think they would drift through, and they were probably, showing up in some numbers in the decades before that, but only confirmed as breeding. It's not an easy nest to find. Vultures will basically just lay their eggs on a rocky ledge somewhere really hard to get to. So perhaps they were nesting before that, but somebody made the effort right on the Willard Pond Cliffs about 4 decades ago, right on the Harris Center Super Sanctuary.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've walked by those cliffs. Somebody, I think when I first moved to the area, pointed that out to me. It might have been Neil Clark, and told me that that's where the first pair was seen. And every time I go by there, there's now a trail that goes right near them. But every time I walked by them, I always wondered. We do have lots of really great questions. Yeah, Mead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. This is Mead Caddo.
Yeah, well, I actually took a photograph of a young turkey vulture on those ledges up there.
Wow.
And I remember it well. And there's a bizarre theory that might be right, that they followed the interstates north, following the carrion trail left behind. Who knows?
I've heard that too, and I wondered, yeah, makes sense to me. Wow, well, interesting. Not only did it bring cars, it might have brought vultures up to New Hampshire. So here's a question that I bet a lot of people wonder about, and you're really well suited to answer this one because you've been a hawk watcher, but how do you keep your concentration to watch hawks day after day after day, like looking up in the sky? How do you do it?
What was that? I wasn't paying attention. Oh, I'm kidding.
Hysterical.
Yeah, it does take some concentration, and it's definitely a learned skill. It comes with experience of doing it day in and day out, and getting a feel for how the birds are moving. And being a hawk watcher, I've never been a hawk watcher for a full season, but just doing it for a day at a time here and there. You have to figure out a balance that works between the interaction with the public too, and keeping an eye on the sky, and always having an eye on birds. I mean, I've been a birder my whole life, so for me, it's kind of first nature, being tuned into the birds, and I have to keep an ear out for people. But everybody has a different strategy, I think.
That's great. I liked how you described keeping the ear out for people. So Lynn was wondering about why broadwings in such huge numbers, because in her experience, she has only ever really seen broadwings in her backyard, or in her area once or twice. So where are they all, and why do you see them in such huge numbers?
Yeah, great question. In the summer, they are a very common but distributed, widespread species in New England, and they're generally only active in their family unit throughout the summer months. And even the spring migration in our area is not super concentrated. So in the fall, the birds tend to concentrate because of thermals. It seems to be the thermals, the warm air, that gives them the lift they need in order to migrate south. It's really energetics. It comes down to what is most energy efficient for the species to gather for this warm air mass, which will get them as high as they can, so they can cruise south with a tailwind, flapping their wings as little as possible. So that's really what seems to draw them together. I don't think there's a little secret society of broad-winged hawks getting together for other reasons, but there is the timing too. They're a long-distance migrant, which means they're a little more cued into the daylight triggers as a reason for migrating. And those species, the long-distance migrants, they're not responding as readily as the short-distance migrants to these, maybe some of the climate change influenced factors that are, what's making for the red-tailed hawks to delay their migration. So the daylight trigger seems to be the thing that gets them moving at the same time. Hopefully they'll always find the thermals they need so they can still get to where they're going, but I could see, climate change being a factor there, and, maybe, limiting how far they can get because of the timing of the thermals forming. So it's that time of year that brings the birds down through the central states, gets them to where they're going. And then it gets much cooler with a lot more cold fronts in October. So, that window is relatively narrow in September. But it's also coincidentally around when they run out of their food source of amphibians, and the songbirds are migrating, and mammals might be getting a little harder to access at that point.
Great, thanks,
Long
Phil.
answer. Hope I answered that right.
No, it was a really great answer, very thorough and very interesting too. And here's a question that I know I've asked you, and I really like your answer, but Howard and Gail want to know if you can see the northward migration in the springtime. And is it as big as the ones the migration that's happening now? Is it more spread out? How's it different?
Well, not in our particular area. You can't see it as well. You don't see the numbers gather in our part of New England because of probably the geographic features and the way the winds are in the spring. However, if you're somewhere on the Great Lakes or on the coast, you'll still see these really large concentrations. So some Hawkwatch sites on the Great Lakes will see their biggest flights during the spring because of where they're located. Right at a bend of a lake that's hundreds of miles long that the birds don't want to cross, so they'll have to follow the shoreline. So around here, we have kind of rolling topography. We have some short ridge lines like Pack, but the winds don't usually develop, and I think the thermals aren't as strong during the time frame they're migrating. So here, yeah, you can see hawks migrating, and it's just more distributed. It's on a broader front. So I think they're moving very differently, but hopefully we'll learn more about how broad-winged hawks are migrating with our broad-winged hawk project coming up next year.
Yeah, that's exciting.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so Jeannie mentioned that just recently she found a dead hawk. She wasn't quite sure what type it was, but it was maybe a red-tailed hawk, and it was dead around her community where she lives, where they're doing a lot of building and constructing. And she found it was on its back, so its chest was up and its head was missing, and she was wondering if a predator got it. But then she was very curious too about the impact of rodenticides on raptor population. She wondered if that could have been a thing, what killed the hawk. But could you talk a little bit about rodenticides and its impact on raptor populations, and maybe its contribution to the decline of some of them?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on the topic, but I know it does have a big impact on birds of the open country, especially. So any sort of contaminants that are being applied widely in agricultural settings could impact species like kestrels and barn owls to our south. Hawk Mountain has done a lot of work on that front, with educating people about the use of rodenticides, which they're just the rodents that these animals consume bioaccumulate within the species, within the individual, and eventually that becomes toxic to them if they have too many. So yeah, I think it's probably still a threat around where we are. We just don't get to see the impact of rodenticide that much. I think the cases of documented poisoning that we come across are probably pretty limited, but that could be a great question for Maria Colby, and
Yeah.
I'd love to know more about that myself.
So
But yeah,
Maria,
I think of large agricultural settings, but it could happen more than we know about.
yeah.
And it's just one of many factors that's reducing kestrel populations in the country.
Wow. Thanks, Phil. That was great. We're just about out of time. What I wanted to say to everybody, Harley asked a great question about Veracruz and wondering if there's a big spring migration. And Harley, I'm going to ask you to save the question and come see Kashmir next Tuesday night. And if you didn't get your question answered tonight, you might be able to ask Kashmir a question, a similar question, when you see him on Tuesday night. And hopefully many of you will show up and keep hawk watching when you get a chance. Eyes to the sky. Phil, do you want to add anything?
Yeah,
Last comments?
I was just going to share my email address if anybody had any other last questions they wanted to send. So I just posted that. If you have something that you'd like answered about raptors.
Great, Phil. That was so nice of you to share your
But
email.
yeah, thank you for tuning in. Hope that was informative for everybody.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you, Phil. If you were in the Harris Center's Babbitt room, we'd be all clapping and applauding you right now. So we're going to give you a thumbs up. Thanks for sharing that incredible knowledge and information about the state of the hawks in New Hampshire and the Northeast. Thanks a ton. And thank you all of you for coming, and see you out there hawk watching.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.